I've wanted to talk about romance anime for a while now. Like, I've watched more than my fair share, and every time I go online to see other people's opinions, there seems to be wildly differing reception. I felt that this one in particular was good for discussion because it highlights many of the good and bad aspects of this genre of rom-com. Anyhow, I've got a short attention span, so I'll likely be splitting this video up into several parts. In the first few parts, I'll be talking about romance anime in general and Shikimori, and after that I'll discuss Love is War before finally probably discussing Date Alive. Oh yeah, and if I randomly watch another anime and feel that it fits into this weird mini-series, then yeah, I'll just add it in. To start off, I'll give my opinion on the current state of romance anime. My two favourite at this current moment in time would be Date Alive and Love is War. But I feel as if my taste in romance anime has changed quite a bit recently, which I think is due to me consuming so many in such a short period of time. The main thing that makes these two stand out in particular is that they are relatively novel in terms of their execution and plots. This may seem off topic, but you'll see where I'm getting at. Now, not to say that there's necessarily any issue with this, but most romance anime belong into one large overarching category. Think like nisekoi or gamers, and even this season's Shikimori is not just a cutie. They all fit into the very general plotline of high schoolers constantly in a struggle of misunderstandings in order to convey their feelings for one another. Or similarly, high schoolers already in a relationship awkwardly making their way through normal experiences. Anyhow, I can hear you saying, well yeah, that's obviously what romance animes are, and that's the point. When the initial premise is built on something that's somewhat bland on its own, each anime must find a way to separate themselves from the pack. And I've devised the three main ways that they go about doing this. The first way is to add a random trope or premise that adds something different. Just imagine all the generic isekais like I was reincarnated as a slime, or the strongest sage with the weakest crest. They're all mostly the same, just with some trope that separates them from the rest. In romance anime terms, think like Komi Can't Communicate, where the special premise is that the main love interest has severe communication difficulties, or this season's Shikimori is not just a cutie, where the special difference is that the main love interest is extremely all-rounded, talented, which I think is like the main premise. Or an example that I feel really demonstrates both the positives and the negatives of this style, the manga called The Cute Girl Sitting Next to Me is trying to make me fall in love with her as a way to ridicule me, but the tables were turned on her before she knew it. And yes, this is the full title of it. Now it seems not much explanation is needed for the plot, but all in all, this method is a quick way of adding some spice to the base romance plot. But whilst this is not necessarily bad, it just suffers the problem that when the premise runs dry, the show really struggles. This is especially evident in the manga I just mentioned, because whilst the idea seemed really interesting at first, the problem arose once the author needed to move the story along. The manga lacked effective and interesting characters, which caused it to be extremely boring once the initial intrigue ran out. The second way is to just double down on the comedy aspects of the show, the fated rom-com. Love is War fits into this category, as does several others including gamers and isekai. This genre is usually characterized by extremely exaggerated reactions, extensively absurd plotlines, and an infinite number of misunderstandings. This usually pushes the show further into the comedy category than it does the romance category, instead making it more of like a comedy show with romance included. Obviously, shows go into this to differing extents, and go about it in different ways, which is what sets some apart from others. These shows can be rather enjoyable at first as their humor, however slapstick, generates a significant amount of excitement for the viewer. The main drawback of this premise is that it is extremely difficult for any romantic developments to actually occur. With Love is War as somewhat of an exception, shows like this generally lose a lot of their intrigue and interest if the main leads get together. This is because it is a lot harder to generate the absurdist comedy once the characters are dating. As a result, shows of this type are generally very dragged out and suffer from the problem that no matter what happens, nothing seems to happen. It can all get very frustrating for the viewer to constantly see the leads getting into romantic situations only to have nothing occur as the result. This can lead to shows being empty and hollow. Gamers, Nisekai, and many other shows suffer from this. The third way is just to simply add another genre and subplot into the romance. For example, Darling in the Franxx and Date Alive both incorporate a plotline which is separate from the main romance plot. This way, the show is not too reliant on the romance, and like constantly trying to put characters in romantic situations, and that allows for a more natural feeling of development. We get to see characters talk and interact in situations which maybe are high stakes or intense, bringing out more of their personalities and ultimately making the romance element more interesting. Obviously, this design has problems in itself. If done poorly, it could lead to the characters being underdeveloped, since the show has to balance two separate developments which may not intersect with each other. This is uncomfortably visible when shows like this resort to generic character tropes like the tsundere or the little sister type. Asterix War is a show that is extremely guilty of doing this. With half-baked characters and chemistry, the romance element feels extremely unnatural, and sometimes even uncomfortable. Shows of this style sometimes fall into the trap where they try to develop a relationship too fast, such as making the male lead suddenly swoop in to save the heroine and then suddenly they're in love. This type of development is extremely dull and especially unnatural. So cool, you've managed to separate romance anime into categories. Now what, I hear you saying. Now I'll explain how this relates to Shikimori, not just to Cutie. This show, as I explained earlier, falls into the first category, a special premise. Now I don't think it falls into that category as extensively as some other shows, but the main intrigue is Shikimori herself, instead of like any specific relationships, or just the relationships in general, which is why I still think it belongs in that category. Oh yeah, I'll also be going into manga spoilers, although I feel like with this type of show, spoilers don't really mean that much, but I'll put it out there anyways. I'll begin with my favorite chapter from the manga. It's Volume 4, Chapter 43. It begins with Kamiya being confronted by Shikimori, as the two of them engage in a very important conversation. This chapter magnificently develops the character of Kamiya. The entire tone of this chapter was somewhat hypnotic and darker in tone, which was a welcome surprise in between chapters of mostly comedy. It gave both Kamiya and Shikimori's characters much more depth, and most importantly, it justified why they liked Izumi. What I find lacking in a lot of these romance type shows is that the justification for liking the main character is often lacking, incredibly surface level, or just completely unbelievable. This is especially true for characters who aren't the female lead, such as Marika from Nisekai, Neko from Masamune-kun's Revenge, and Yuno from Future Diary. Just to reinstate, this was one of my favorite chapters from any romance-style manga in a long time. Also, I'll talk more about this in the next video where I'll probably discuss their characterization in more detail. In the end, I'm hoping to make this all into one big video, but since I'm an instant gratification yearning monkey, I'm gonna make several smaller videos first. Anyways, expect the next video out within the next few days. Anyways, here's the second video of the video series I'm doing now. If you haven't watched the first, do it, because I'm going to get straight into this, going from where we left off in the first video. I really enjoyed the level of depth put into their backstories and relationships. This show doesn't have those overly exaggerated incidents where the girl falls in love with the boy just because he saved her from a truck or whatever. The emotions of the characters feel natural, and sometimes love doesn't need extensive justification. Well, I mean, those incidents do occur, but it's more used in a comedic sense than any actual, reasoning for their romantic feelings towards each other. Also, this show very effectively demonstrates Izumi's kindness, which makes the reason for Kamiya and Shikimori liking him much more logical. Honestly, their relationship is one of the best I've seen in terms of believability and also compassion. As someone who's seen shows like Girlfriend, Rent-a-Girlfriend, Nisekai, and even this show surpasses them by miles in terms of actual romantic justification. Although, my selection of shows just then might have seemed somewhat biased, since when someone thinks of the best romance anime, those shows don't exactly come to mind. But when I decided to choose them, it was because those shows actually use a remarkably similar style to develop many of their characters. Unlike a show like, say, Toradora, those shows are much more light-hearted in tone, thus comparing a light-hearted comedy with a show that specializes in deeper romantic themes wouldn't really be fair. The show's greatest strength is definitely the way they handle emotive themes. The problem with many other romance anime is their tendency to over-romanticize or straight up ridicule the more poignant ideas that they choose to include. Take Ruka from Rent-a-Girlfriend for example. Her relationship with Kazuya was handled extremely poorly, one of the best examples of bad writing. Her entire backstory with Kazuya was filled with pointless fan service, but after that, the way they develop her feelings and especially the reactions to her own words are incredibly frustrating. I don't want to go into too much detail since this is a Shikimori video, but I'll link a good analysis in the description. The show very nicely balances the use of flashbacks, which adds a nice bit of depth and foreshadowing. I really enjoyed most of the show's flashbacks as they gave a very appealing emotive aesthetic, which I really enjoyed. The problem I have with the show though, is the lack of any dramatic tension. The problem mostly lies with the character of Shikimori herself. Granted, the entire point of the show is that Shikimori is an overpowered badass who can do almost anything, but there has to be situations where she is not the best. The show tries to make up for this by making her bad at cooking and giving her other somewhat comical shortcomings. This is less of a solution and more of an awkward way of adding unneeded depth to Shikimori's character. I would have much preferred they just make her really good at most things and just like decent at others. There was no need to give her such exaggerated and tropey weaknesses. One of my least favourite moments in the first few episodes is when she wins the volleyball game against Kamiya. I felt that it was extremely undeserved. Kamiya was stated to be the volleyball prodigy, yet when Shikimori got a little bit of motivation from Izumi, she suddenly overtook her and won the game from a losing position. I really dislike this because it undermines the other characters in the show. I'll try to explain this with an example. Shirogane from Love is War is a character who has very many weaknesses. However, he is still relevant and respected throughout the show because he has one very great strength, which is the reason he doesn't just immediately feel inferior to Kaguya. Kaguya is an extremely talented person at many things, rich, and also for most intensive purposes superior to Shirogane in nearly every way. However, to the viewer, it still seems that Shirogane is on Kaguya's level because he is superior to her at studying, which is one of the most respected traits in the show. Just imagine if during the first arc, Kaguya suddenly got some motivation and beat Shirogane at studying. As much as the show would try to tell the viewer that Shirogane is respectable and cool, it would feel kind of empty because he would just feel inferior to Kaguya in every single way. This is what happened to Kamiya. The show tried to portray her as a cool, dependable upper-class student. However, in the first incident where she meets with Shikimori, she instantly gets beat at her best ability, volleyball. It undermines her character quite a lot. This is why it annoyed me so much. I really liked the character of Kamiya, and especially her relationship with Izumi, yet the show builds her up to be this strong-minded, cold and distant upperclassman, which really intrigued me, and then instantly threw her into the sand by having her constantly be overshadowed by Shikimori and then seem like a child. I feel like they ruined the tone and effectiveness of her character by doing this. Shikimori is not just the cutie, also suffers from several of the problems I noted earlier. I've read through quite a few chapters of the manga and I've noticed that the Shikimori with the cool face is rather overused. I wasn't exactly a massive fan of that specific look in the first place, but it was at least pretty cool the first few times. Although I've noticed that the show is trying to have its cake and eat it too, with the way it makes its events occur. This is not too big of an issue though. Again, too many times there have been minuscule incidents or just straight up nonsensical occurrences, all for the sole purpose of letting Shikimori show off. Now the show tries to justify this by stating that Izumi has always been unlucky, and that's why he keeps getting into these incidents. I don't necessarily have a problem with this type of luck related justification. I love Nagito Komaeda from the Danganronpa series. However, this justification just seems too overly convenient. I would have been fine with this if Izumi himself wasn't so annoyingly incompetent at almost everything. The way that every single Izumi interaction results in him looking like a helpless child is frustrating to watch. At least they could have added a little bit of depth to this by making Izumi a little more apathetic to this type of incident. I get that he's relatively self-aware, but it still annoys me every time this type of interaction plays out. Anyways, overall, I really liked this show, although it did have some downsides, but in general, it was a nice read, and I would still recommend this. So that's about it for the first part of this video essay thing. I'll be doing Love is War next, so stay tuned for that. And that's all for now.